Okay, today is Friday, June 23rd, 2023. The two texts for today are Romans 9 and Matthew 10, and I'll read the highlighted text. So then he has mercy upon whomever he wills, talking about God, and he hardens the heart of whomever he wills. Matthew, this is Christ talking. Everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. So today we're talking about the doctrine of election, which is the idea that God chooses some people to be saved. And a couple of notes. Romans 9 has a specific emphasis on a certain historical group, but still contains within it the idea of God's sovereign choice in matters of salvation. The Matthew text indicates that this choice or will of God for the fate of human beings is ultimately tied up with belief in Christ. There does seem to be in Matthew sort of this interpretive possibility that salvation is related to human freedom, at least to the extent to which an acknowledgement seems to be an act of a human being's will, though I think you could probably read this, and I think most people do, as still reliant on the first text or in some way related, namely that the acknowledgement of a human being of the Christ is entirely dependent on a prior decision by God. And so the doctrine of election generally hinges on a choice by God to save some people and not others. So we've been talking the last couple of days about the nature of God's creation of the world as an act of his sacrifice, and his sacrifice of his eternal nature to finitude. And I think in that sacrifice ultimately lives the meaning of election. So a more formal or even traditional theological way of saying that God sacrificed himself in the creation of the world is that the Father created the world in and through the Son, through whom, in an act of, to quote one theologian, ineffable condescension, God embraced the creature in the fullness of self-giving. So on this understanding of creation, it is Christ who is both the subject and the first object of election. He is, in some sense, the one who does the electing, to the extent that he is the person through whom the world is created, and he is also the object of election, or the one who is elected, because he is also the recipient of the disintegration of God's eternity into finitude. So we might say that God elected himself, and he elected himself to be rejected in the person of the Son and in the man of Jesus Christ. So he was elected to the extent that he is the creator, or at least the person through whom the world is created, and he was rejected in the sense that he is also the recipient of God's disintegration of infinity to finitude. So the very act of creation in and through the Son is an act of God's having elected himself for the sacrifice of eternity for finitude. So I think ultimately what this means is that in and through the second person, God himself endures the torments of his own sacrifice and disintegration in the act of creation, or more formally, God is always ontologically the recipient of the conditions of finitude, including sin, evil, trauma, etc. And there's a text often cited from the Bible: there is no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus, or to interpret it how we're thinking, because of the nature of the second person, the whole sphere of evil has been overcome. So essentially, God is both the subject and the object of his own disintegration in the creation of the world. And so human suffering, this is going to start to get a bit tricky, but part of the idea will be that the recipient of evil is God himself. So the psychological appeal of this position is evident in that it provides a doctrine of election that's intimately related to the nature of God and creation and to the structure of the order of the natural world. So election here becomes equivalent to, rather than an attribute of, the act of creation, wherein God elects himself to be rejected in and as his creative act. So an implication of this approach is that election or reprobation, in this view, is not something that individuals are or are not, or do not do, but something that has already happened as a condition of the creation of the world and of human beings. Okay, the obvious problem here is this would, as a result, recontextualize the traditional understanding of election as an ontological category. People are elected or they're not, to an epistemic category. So election is something that is ontologically already accomplished by the Son of God, and so there's no degree of freedom there. And the human being's relationship to this ontological fact, as knowledge or as ignorance, is the only open question. So I think we might ask whether this fails to satisfy the simple observation that those who have been understood to have been elected in an ontological sense meaningfully alter the direction and course of their lives, so that election as an epistemic condition would need then to be re-understood according to the ontological one. Put differently, those under the epistemic condition who do not come to know the nature of creation as God's self-sacrifice seem to be, through means of biological or other deficit of capacity, still, quote, this is Calvin, those whom God passes over for no other reason than he wills to exclude them from the inheritance which he predestines for his own children. So put differently, a life transformed more deeply into the image of God. So the question is, do not both the ontological and epistemic conditions still implicate a sovereign choice of God? So the idea is that even if election is inherent in the nature of creation, is not the fate of the individual tied up with God's choice? And so I think it is, but the point to make here is that if the ontological equivalence of creation and election is right, then the acts or omissions of an individual in their human lives does not determine the ontological state of their salvation, which has already been determined by the very nature of creation, but only the extent to which that salvation is lived out under the conditions of finitude. This does not mean that every human being under the conditions of finitude must endure those other beings who lack the epistemic condition, namely the knowledge of their having been made in the image of the sacrifice of God, even if the attitude of those who satisfy the epistemic condition tend towards a deeper commitment to the mercy of God, who in creation rejected himself. It does, however, mean that there is reason to believe that no distinguishing ontological judgment can be made.